Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Panel 6, 5% for Freedom, NATO, and the Future of Ukraine. Please welcome to the stage Miss Kate Odell of the Wall Street Journal and our distinguished panelists.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this panel on 5% for Freedom, Ukraine, and the future of NATO. We've got a tight time frame today, so we're going to dive right in. I'd like to introduce my distinguished guests here. Next to me, I have Coons, the senator from Delaware. In the middle, Antti Häkkänen, the defense minister of Finland. And then on the end, we have Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, Trump's envoy and active in the discussions over new Ukraine. So with that, there's been plenty in the news about Ukraine, and everybody here, I think, is briefed up on it. And so I want to open our time together by asking General Kellogg, what does a good deal in Ukraine look like? How will you know if it's a good deal that NATO can live with in Ukraine?
That was a great question. Thank you for the panel. One, happy Independence Day to your nation. It's really great, your 4th of July. So I think that's really good. And I also have to say to people in the audience that I was a great interview with our Secretary of War by Lucas Tomlinson. I do disagree with him tremendously on the last question he had. So with everybody clutching their pearls here, the fact is I'm an Army guy, so it's beat Navy next week. So we'll go with that. You know, I think when he talks with Ukraine, where we're at today compared to where we're at a year or 2 years ago, if you're a military guy, especially you're at ground, Marine Corps or infantry, that you realize the last 10 meters to objective is always your hardest. That's where the friction of war really sets in. And I think we're at the last 10 meters of trying to end this conflict where it's at. I think we're really down to a couple of issues, and the issues that are one are on terrain, which is primarily Donetsk, which is the second oblast. You have Luhansk, Donetsk, and you call Zaporizhia and Kherson. And the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is currently in cold storage right now, but that is a huge nuclear power plant. If we get those two issues settled, I think the rest of the things will work out fairly well. It's been hard. It's been hard to work through the issues with everybody. But, you know, I'd like to remind everybody in the room, you know, the scale of that war is unprecedented when it comes to regional conflict. The Soviet Union left Afghanistan after losing 18,000. We left Vietnam after losing 58,000. Russia and Ukraine combined have lost over 2 million. Think about that. That is horrific numbers out there. And so we need to get the conflict to an end. President Trump has seen that. President Trump has gone out of his way to talk to people, which is great. He's talked to Putin, to Zelensky, and anybody else he needs to talk to. So I think we're almost there. I won't speak for the negotiators or how it's working right now, but it's a full team effort, and the Ukrainians have been very good about who they have sent to the negotiations with Umarov out there, and we'll just have to, you know, wait and see how it goes. But we're really, really close.
Senator Coons, I want to ask you a form of the same question. I mean, zeroing in on a security guarantee for Ukraine and a promise for them that this won't just happen again in a few years. What does a credible security guarantee look like that Putin might even be remotely willing to accept?
Well, that's the core challenge, and that's why I think we're not close to seeing the end of this war, is that Putin has repeatedly rejected any reasonable proposal that would leave Ukraine capable of defending itself, secure from renewed rearmament and aggression by Putin, which we can expect with certainty, and that makes sense of the enormous sacrifice of the Ukrainians. Let's be clear, Putin is the aggressor here. Russia invaded Ukraine. This is not, there's great people on both sides of this conflict, not even close. Fred Ryan began this morning by quoting President Reagan, and I'm paraphrasing, but I think it was, peace is not just the absence of war, but the presence of justice. A just end to this war would not mean our coercing a democracy to concede ground that Russia has not been able to take, and conceding a cap on their military, and conceding a cap on their potential joining NATO. at all, what would a security guarantee look like? European troops on the ground, American Air Force patrolling the skies, unlimited access to and a guarantee of U.S. intelligence and armament availability, preferably paid for by the Ukrainians and the Europeans. But if it's not that, if it's just some nice pledge that Putin will discover his inner child and not try and invade them again, I think that is an obscenity to coerce Ukraine into accepting that. Putin is a thug and a gangster, and he will only stop when we stop him, and we've had unity. NATO has stepped forward and taken on a dramatically greater role in this, our European partners and allies. We should let them keep doing that, and we should not step back until Putin agrees to a security guarantee and a cessation of hostilities along the current lines and with a guarantee that allows Ukraine to arm itself and defend itself.
I've also been delinquent in reminding you folks that you can submit your own questions, and I will review them up here and would love to include them in our conversation. To take it to the defense minister for a moment, why don't you give us Europe's view of these negotiations? I mean, we have had some noting today that if Europe views what's going on in Ukraine as an existential threat to Europe's security, how do we account for the reluctance to seize Russian frozen assets, the discussion around buying Russian oil? How does Europe view those? What accounts for that reticence in Europe?
Well, thank you. First of all, I think that when we are talking about this peace agreement or arrangement, we have to understand first that what is the Russian main strategic objectives in a global scale. So they want to restore the Russian power politics in global, they want to restore Soviet Union's sphere of influence, and this is a part of that game. And the lessons learned from last 2 decades in Europe was that we tried to do energy trade business with Russia. We thought that that will bring peace for Russia in Europe. No. They used all the money from Russian side to do a new military buildup and attack to Ukraine. So let's not think that Russia has changed somehow. And the second lesson learned is that when Russia attacked to Georgia 2008, West didn't do nothing. When Russia attacked to Crimea 2014, West didn't do nothing. And now is the case that what is our reaction? Because we have seen from last 2 decades that the weakness provokes Russia to continue. So that's why this kind of general perspective about these arrangements has to be peace through strength. So and all these kind of pillars what we are now making has to handle Ukraine, their dignity, just peace, but also Russia. If we are rewarding Russia to attacking to neighbor, that will even encourage Russia in future to continue that kind of behavior.
Senator, is Ukraine losing the war? That narrative has started to be paramount in Washington, that Ukraine needs to get a deal now because the next deal may be worse. Do you agree? Is Ukraine losing the war?
Not at all. There is a risk that Ukraine is losing support. The national security strategy just released, must give some encouragement to Putin that the administration is losing its focus and its interest. But what we saw in the survey is that an overwhelming majority of the American people support continuing with the effort to defend Ukraine's freedom. I don't think Ukraine is at risk of a collapse on the front lines, but I obviously am not a military man. They've taken more and more aggressive and capable strikes deep inside Russia at their energy infrastructure. They carried out a spectacular strike on very distant air targets a number of months ago. They've just struck a number of the Shadow Fleet. There are structural challenges, obviously, to Ukraine in terms of generating quality trained troops. But they have managed to fight with incredible durability, bravery, innovation. Their innovations in drone and electronic warfare have been world-class in recent years. I think as long as we send a clear and firm signal from the United States and the dozens of countries that have provided, at this point, more support than we have, that Putin will recognize, whether through sanctions, through the passage of a bipartisan bill in the Senate designating Russia a state sponsor of terrorism for kidnapping tens of thousands of children, or by imposing other costs on their economy and military, that he will then begin to calculate he can't lose the war. But if Putin gets the message that by just grinding away, we will lose interest, we will lose focus and attention, and he can win, then he will. He will not give an inch that he doesn't have to.
I wanted to put up a question from the survey that the Reagan Foundation did for us here about public opinion on Ukraine. And public opinion on Ukraine has shifted in several directions over the past few years. I mean, you saw Republicans under President Biden saying that we were doing too much for Ukraine, that there was no end game in Ukraine. There's been some, I think, change in that a little bit. But I want to look at the slide and talk about, there's clearly a plurality of the country that doesn't think Ukraine should give up a lot more territory in exchange for a peace deal. Thank you, that's great. So there is, on this slide here, 45% support Ukraine's full territorial liberation, and then there's significantly less enthusiasm here for trading territory for security guarantees. I think some of that is because you see in the poll that Americans don't think Putin's going to follow them, and Americans also seem to express that they want Ukraine to win, that they favor Ukraine prevailing. So General Kellogg, I say all that because I want you to help us think about how the president sees this conflict. He talks about it in humanitarian terms, the awful human cost of it, but he also does not talk as much about the U.S. interest or the ideological role in it. Is the United States a mediator in Ukraine?
Well, one, I don't speak for the president. Nobody does. The president speaks for himself, and it's pretty clear when he speaks what he wants to do. And I will tell you from my viewpoint, and I've been in there, and the two things that the senator said is pretty good. Is one, Napoleon had a great saying, a maxim, the morale to the physical is 3:1, meaning you're fighting hard. And seeing with the Ukrainians, they've got a fighting heart, which was what you said. In their subway, when they get attacked by rockets at night in Kyiv, they went to the most dark thing I saw was during a recent conference there was in a populated subway during the middle of an attack, they sang their national anthem. They didn't sit there and worried, rub their hands. It's almost like it probably was, and I wasn't alive then, but like the Blitz of 1940 with England and London. And I think where the president is coming from, and I believe this, is because I've seen him in action in the first term, was I made that comment earlier, the absolute enormous loss of life. And I've been fortunate to go to Irpin Military Hospital and other hospitals inside Ukraine. And the last time we went there, and when you see young men, and there was no one there at the hospital, and we met all of them, that they had lost limbs. One had lost 3 limbs and is blind. But you realize the human tragedy of war, and that's where President Trump is going for. Stop and we will rebuild out later. And I think that is a real consideration on the loss of war, and that's where he's really concerned. Let's just stop this war. We've got to figure it. And I really do get concerned a lot of time about what they call, the British still call, from World War I, the lost generation. And the generation was lost in World War I because of the casualties they took in France, and that whole generation of young men they lost there. And you get worried about the demographics and losing your generation. We'll rebuild. They'll be able to rebuild from where they're at today with the support primarily of Europe. And by the way, Europe can get a bad rap, but I will tell you, Europe has really stood up. They've really come up to the table and have done a very, very good job in military support, in personal support, humanitarian support, and building out the country. So give them credit for that. And your president and I have had a lot of talks, President Stubb, on that. And so, we just want to get the thing over with. It's just that the human tragedy is enormous.
Defense Minister, please.
Just shortly, that's obviously at this point at the negotiation, United States wants peace, Europe wants peace, Ukraine wants peace. But Russia is continuing bombings. Russia is continuing full-scale war and preparing to continue with it. Even though they are using huge amounts of money and manpower in casualties and achieving almost nothing in the battlefield. They are achieving a couple of hundred meters with tens of thousands of casualties. And they are day by day more dependent on China, and they know that their resources and economy is hitting hard now. Why Russia still continues? They think that West is weaker, that they can still a little bit continue and get a good peace for Russia. So that's why I think that the game changers, what we have to now decide, is the European decision in frozen assets, 100 billion euros for Ukraine's 2-year defense, and harder sanctions on oil exports for Russian economy. So those two game changers will create Putin's dilemma. This will last at least 2 years, and Russian economy will fail really hard. And that's what will bring the Putin to the table. And that's too costly for his economy.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a point? You want to jump in?
When I have had the opportunity both to visit Ukraine and to meet with veterans who've lost limbs in this war, they often ask, and I often reflect on, for what? I respect and recognize President Trump wants the fighting to stop and the dying and the suffering to stop. But for what has all this sacrifice been made? You're clear about Russia's aims, expansionism, imperialism, reassert their role in Europe. We've heard from a number of European allies, they believe Russia is not just preparing to fight further in Ukraine, but rearming in order to be able to carry the fight further into NATO territory. Ukrainians have sacrificed, suffered, and died for their freedom and their sovereignty. And if we force them into a peace that does not guarantee that sovereignty and that freedom, we will have made a lasting mistake that Xi Jinping will notice and that authoritarians around the world will notice, and we will pay for it at a much greater loss and at a much greater expense.
Well, Senator, jumping off of that, I mean, I think that seems to suggest that there's not a ready deal right now, and that we're going to have to try to get more leverage to make a deal. So I wanted to ask, the argument against providing more weapon systems you hear is that, well, we tried giving this weapon and that weapon, and my own view is that we did some of that slowly and not particularly at large scale.
Yes.
But my question for you is, would Tomahawks make a difference?
Look, Tomahawks would help at every step. I respect that presidents get access to intelligence and assessments at a higher level than I do. I felt we should have delivered more advanced systems earlier in this war and advised President Biden that that was what I thought was urgently needed. Tomahawks now will not be a game changer, but they'll be additive and important. The Ukrainians are developing Flamingo, long-range, capable with a larger warhead, but a very big profile, cruise missiles of their own. Two things, if I might. One, Ukraine is now at a place where they can be exporters of security. We can and should purchase from them significant quantities of world-class drones that are upgraded and updated according to the most current developments in electronic warfare and defense measures, and that's something that we need. Ukraine is also a very appealing long-term development partner for the United States. Europe is willing to buy from us robust quantities of some of our most advanced and expensive systems, and we should send a long-term demand signal to our defense industrial base that we're committed to that partnership, to arming and equipping Ukraine to defend itself. The alternative is the very real risk that Russia will occupy all of Ukraine and take its very capable and skilled military and its armaments base and turn it against our NATO allies. I think the outcome couldn't be more stark, an outcome where our partnerships and our alliances in Europe that have lasted for decades and provided security for us would be at risk, and where we signal to authoritarians that we do not have the courage or the persistence to defend freedom, and an outcome where Putin ultimately learns that aggression doesn't pay, that we will hold together the West in defense of freedom, and that will send a signal to this generation that may be worth the huge sacrifices that have been made. Nobody knows better than the Finns what it means to stand tough against overwhelming odds and Russian aggression, and to have to make concessions and to have to fight and to have to arm. And I'm so grateful that Finland has joined us as a NATO ally. But I think if you ask Finns what they think is the right outcome here, it is not a peace deal that is on the wrong terms and too early and not sustainable.
Defense Minister, Could Vladimir Putin continue this war if China decided it should stop?
Well, first of all, without China's help and partly also with India's oil buyouts, their cash flows are going really low. So, and without the industrial cooperation between China, Russia, and military components and all that stuff, Russia would have severe problems at this point. Now they have problems, but China is the key player. And that's why I said that we have to do two things to show Putin that Ukraine will have their military support money. That will be 0.2% of the European GDP, 0.2. So not that much for freedom. And second pace, US-Europe, stronger energy sanctions and financial sanctions to Russian economy. We can do it. It's only political will. And that will give the signal to Putin that it will be too expensive to continue it. Use a little bit stick, not only carrot in these negotiations.
General, a question from the audience here. What do you think is the most effective way that President Trump can pressure Russia and Putin that he's not already doing?
Well, I think it's a great question. And I think as a military guy, I will not speak for the president, but in a military situation, for those of you in uniform, the same as you raising your level of risk and risk tolerance. And I think what he has done and what the Senate has done, they've given the tools to be used. And I go back to what Winston Churchill said is in World War II when he said, after trying everything, America will finally get things right. Yes. And it's always usually the last resort. There's the instruments of power that are available are there. And the question is, we're not going to put boots on the ground. But I think the economic, which you brought up, the economic push, primarily is a petro state, and they're going against the shadow fleet. I think in the Black Sea, somebody sunk 2 vessels or had damaged 2 vessels. That was important. That goes back to what you said, Senator, about the technology they have with the drone fleets and one off of Africa. So you apply an economic pressure. It's just not only a kinetic or military issue. It's an issue of economics. Mm-hmm. It's an issue of diplomacy. It's an issue of military as well. And I think President Trump is engaged quite well. I mean, he's at the very least, people will tell you, at least he's talking to him. And that's always an important thing, to keep him talking and to get there. This is it's a very, very hard subject. Not for him, but people would have thought, I would have thought that this was solvable. When you get rational people talking to each other, generally you can find an agreement where you want to go. It may not be an optimal. It may not be the best you're going to get. But, if somebody had said after World War II, well, the situation's bad, look what happened eventually with NATO and the Baltic countries. When you have Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, eventually now they're free countries. So you got to be in it for the long game as well as the short game. And Chancellor Adenauer was the first chancellor of Germany. At the end of World War II, he wanted to unify Germany. He didn't have it right away. He didn't get it right away. But look where Germany is now, under Chancellor Merz. And eventually you play a long game to get a long-term result. Probably not the best answer you want to hear, but that's why President Trump was elected president, and I wasn't. I didn't get a single electoral college vote. You got a point?
Senator Coons, I want to ask you about Ukraine's future in NATO. Is taking Ukraine's membership into NATO or precluding that in a deal, is that an acceptable term, or since we know that Putin is so insistent on that, how do you balance that Western security institution and Ukraine's prerogative to join it with the reality in Russia?
So I think Putin is a thug and a criminal and a gangster. And the way you negotiate with a gangster is not to say, you've taken my thumb, would you like my hand? You've taken my hand, would you like my arm? You've taken my arm, would you like my wife and my farm? You say, you've taken my thumb, screw you, I'm taking off your hand. And then I'm taking your arm. And by saying up front, we will take cards out of Zelensky's hand. We will say, sure, we'll never let them into NATO. Sure, we'll force them to, by taking cards away from the Ukrainians and not letting them make decisions as a sovereign nation about what's in their best interest. I think we have unilaterally harmed Ukraine's ability to sit across a table from Putin and say, we have fought and fought and fought to a standstill. Now here's what we're willing to negotiate. If there is to be a choice that Putin wants a guarantee that Ukraine will not be a NATO member, and that is the most important thing to him, and the Ukrainians concede that that is what they're willing to give up to achieve peace, I think that's a Ukrainian decision. But I think it's wrong for an American leader to take that off the table before Putin. I mean, look, President Trump invited Putin to come to Anchorage and literally rolled out the red carpet for him. Talking to our adversaries can produce positive results, as President Reagan showed. But Putin's response was to double the number of attacks on civilians the next day. And he's doubled them and doubled them again. And so Putin's response to President Trump's overtures has been blindingly clear and murderous. He bombs more civilians all across Ukraine every single day. And so I think we have gone very far in extending ourselves and saying, what else would you like, Mr. Putin? That's not working. It's time to say, you know what? Maybe NATO membership ought to be on the table. Maybe Americans ought to be patrolling the skies over Ukraine, and then see what he says. We get up and worry about Putin escalating and Putin's next move every day. I wish he woke up and worried about our escalation and our next move, because at the end of the day, we know who Putin is, and we know what he's going to do. He needs to be clear that we have the determination to push back against him. Because when I see Putin supported by the DPRK and Iran and the PRC, and the four of them coming closer and closer together, it concerns me if we send a signal of weakness to any of them.
Mm-hmm. You know, Kate, if I may, just the Senator brought up a point about Alaska, but you know, what I really admired, and I wish Chairman Kane was out there, he could say it, was when he and Putin were walking towards the podium, you know, there was B-2s supported by fifth-generation fighters flew overhead, and then he drove them in a vehicle down through rows of fifth-generation fighters. You know, just using that one point, right now with the Russians and the Allies and the United States, they can field about 100 fifth-generation fighters. We can field in Europe 400. So this is it's a warning to Russia that, you know, if you really want to dance with us, we'll dance, okay? And we have the military backing, the power, both the alliance and the United States, to do that. And it's only dependent on the decisions of the President of the United States. So I'm sure that he noticed that was deliberate. He understands, based on what you said as a former KGB officer, that he understands the optics of the moment. And the optics of the moment were pretty clear, that if you want to engage the United States, this is what we bring to the table. And then if you think about it with your generals, you know, this is what the alliance brings to the table as well. It's pretty powerful. 3 nuclear powers, all the aircraft, all the ground forces. And I happen to think, and we have some European friends in the audience, that, and I will say this candidly, I don't think Europe realizes how good they really are. You're really strong. You really have a capacity, and you've got a moral capacity, you've got a physical capacity that sometimes I think you need the umbrella, as the senator said, of 75 plus years of our umbrella. You really don't need it. You really don't. It's hard to say after 75 years, but your president has read a great article just published in Foreign Affairs, and it's a new way of looking at the world. And I think people, if you have a chance and you're interested in foreign affairs, you ought to get the magazine Foreign Affairs and read the article from President Stubb. It's really good.
Yes, I want to jump off on that Foreign Affairs article. Let's look first at, though, the second slide that we have for today, which is about public opinion on NATO and what Americans think of NATO. And I think you can see that the favorability rate on NATO is trending upward and has jumped 6 points even from this summer. And I think one of the takeaways here is that the 5% defense spending pledge mattered. And when Americans see NATO taking European continental defense really seriously, they tend to approve of it and see the value of that institution. So I want to ask the defense minister here about that pledge, and if you could talk specifically about the ship deal that the OMB director mentioned this morning. You know, how quickly can that partnership be executed to get those ships in the water? But also, you know, just more broadly on, as the general was talking about, that foreign affairs piece by Stubb saying what happens in the next 5 years will determine the decades to come for European security. So talk to us about both of those things and how serious Europe is taking this pledge for 5%.
Well, first of all, I think that everyone knows that Russia and China, their main strategic objective in global politics is to break the US-led world order. And the first pillar to break it is to break the alliances and the unity. That's why I think that this NATO 5% pledge was important, that now the Europe is really taking the own responsibility of the European security, and the US can focus a little bit more in Indo-Pacific area. It has to be committed to NATO, and we are at the same level at the understanding how we are now arranging things. So, and the Europe is now on right track. Last summer's decision to spend 5%, it will be at about a little bit over 900 billion euros yearly when it's in a full scale. And now countries have started to invest. There's a clear signs in every country, especially Germany. They will raise up their spending levels to really high numbers. Finland has invested heavily for decades, but we are also raising our spending levels, and I'm quite sure, and this at the end game, even though China and Russia will be aggressive in next 10 decades, Europe and US will be stronger than ever with these spending rates, and that will bring peace to the table. And what comes to this wise usage of money, how to do an industrial cooperation between US and European countries, I think that the icebreaker deal between Finland's and US presidents and our countries is a really good example how to do cost-effective way mutual benefits in industrial level. We are producing 4 ones in Finland and rest of them in US. Mm-hmm. About 80% of the icebreakers in the world has been designed in Finland. And that's a good way to also elaborate to the other defense industry and security industry fields that we can get benefits for our taxpayers, a lot of more capacity to defense and security. If we look at the China and Russia's industry, they can produce several times compared to Western countries. 4 times cheaper ammunition, 4 times cheaper ships, naval vessels, submarines, icebreakers, all that stuff. So we have to also do this kind of joint, and maybe we need some kind of investment to your home country, US and Europe, but still taxpayers' money has to be used wisely. Mm-hmm.
We are running out of time much faster than I'd like, but General, to finish up with you, the Defense Secretary said today that it was hard to imagine several years ago going to a NATO target of 5%, and certainly from my time covering it, that's true. My question is, can the United States stay around 3% on Japan on defense if our allies are going closer to 5%?
Well, the president has said with the Hague Agreement that everybody's going to 5%, and that's a lot of money to do that. And at the same time we're spending the money, remember we're also modernizing our nuclear fleet, the bombers, the missiles, and the submarines as well. That costs a lot of money. So it's up to our representatives, the Senate and the House, where they're going to go with that. But if you get to the 5% level, that is, for the Americans, that's an enormous expenditure. The allies are different. Now, we know the Poles have gotten there. They're going there, and we know the other countries. Some countries won't get there. I guarantee you they won't. There are certain countries that are 1.5% today, even though you agreed years ago at Wales. In the Wales Declaration, they'd get to 2.5% of their GDP. They never even got to that. So, but it's important because the weaponry we've gotten has become so expensive. It's so complicated to use, and I think it's going to make a hard American decision as well. Where do you get to defense? We haven't been there in a while. It's almost like we've been flatlined with 2.5%. But part of that is because it's their strategy of how we intend to fight and create war and deter. And for people, I'll make it a shorthand for you. The Army back in the day, back in my day, we're at a 2.5 war strategy. And that means you could fight an active war in the Atlantic, you could fight an active war in the Pacific, and you could have 0.5 as your contingency. We now fund at 1.0. You can fight a major war in one theater. And our stockage levels, and when you look at what the Secretary of War and the Chairman are doing, the stockage levels, because we only have 5 defense primes, you cut down on the ability to backfill that. So I think there's a lot of things you have to consider. We need the support of Congress to get there. When you get to there, everybody needs to understand, what does it mean when you get 5%? 5% is easy to say, but the implementation is really, really hard. And it falls on the back of the American people.
Well, we have to wrap up our discussion, but thank you so much for joining us at this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much.